What happens when one fleeting moment of passion disrupts a lifetime of routine? Would you risk it all to feel alive again? That dinner didn't just change my life. It revealed truths I had long buried and forced me to confront the woman I had become. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more gripping tales and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. The moment our lips met, the world seemed to dissolve into the darkness around us. It wasn't a frantic kiss, no urgency, no desperation, just a slow, deliberate connection. His hand moved to cup my face, and I leaned into his touch without hesitation. For a fleeting second, it felt like time had stopped, and nothing else existed outside of this forbidden moment. But as the kiss deepened, reality came crashing down. I pulled back abruptly, my breath hitching as I pressed a trembling hand to my lips. What are we doing?" I whispered, my voice shaky and almost inaudible. Evan didn't respond immediately. His eyes, wide with surprise, searched mine in the dim light as though trying to gauge whether I regretted it or wanted more. "Janine, he started, but I shook my head, cutting him off. "This was a mistake," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. The truth was, it didn't feel like a mistake at all, and that terrified me. I stood quickly, creating distance between us. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way toward the kitchen, needing the cool counter beneath my hands to ground me. Behind me, I could hear the soft shuffle of Evan standing up, but he didn't follow right away. "Janine, wait," he called out gently after a moment, his voice laced with concern. I turned to face him, wrapping my arms around myself as though that could shield me from the storm of emotions brewing inside. This can't happen, Evan," I said firmly, even as my chest ached with the effort of pushing him away. "We're not," he asked, stepping closer. "It felt right. Didn't it feel right to you?" His words sent a shiver down my spine. Of course it had felt right. Too right, that was the problem. The lingering connection. I didn't answer him, but the silence must have spoken volumes because he nodded, almost to himself, before stepping back. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," he said quietly. "You didn't," I replied automatically, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, you did, but I let it happen. I'm just as much at fault." His brows furrowed, and for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Janine. I care about you." The sincerity in his voice cut through my resolve like a knife. How long had it been since someone cared about me like that? Greg loved me in his own distant way, but he didn't see me anymore. He didn't ask how I was feeling or notice when I needed comfort. Evan, though? He saw me. "I think you should go," I said, forcing the words out despite how much they hurt. "But Janine, please." "Even," I interrupted, mustering as much authority as I could. "Please, just go." He hesitated, clearly torn, but finally nodded. "If that's what you want," he said softly, his voice tinged with disappointment. It wasn't what I wanted, not even close, but I didn't trust myself to say anything else. As the front door clicked shut behind him, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a lead blanket. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, burying my face in my hands. The next morning, I woke up feeling raw. The kiss replayed in my mind on a loop, each detail more vivid than the last. The warmth of his lips, the way his hand cradled my face, the unspoken longing in his eyes. It was intoxicating and maddening all at once. I avoided the window for most of the day, unwilling to risk seeing him. But by mid-afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. Peeking through the curtains, I saw him outside, mowing the lawn. He looked as composed as ever, as though nothing had happened. It should have been reassuring, but it only left me feeling more conflicted. How could he carry on so easily while I felt like my entire world had tilted on its axis? By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to clear the air to make sure we were on the same page. I convinced myself it was the mature thing to do. I walked over to his house, my heart pounding with every step. He answered the door almost immediately, his expression a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "Janine," he said, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated in the doorway. "We need to talk." He nodded, gesturing toward the couch. I sat down, folding my hands tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. "About last night," I began, but he cut me off. "I meant what I said," he interjected, his voice steady. "I care about you, Janine. And I know this is complicated, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are." His words were both a balm and a burden. Part of me wanted to believe we could figure it out, that we could have something real despite the glaring obstacles. But another part, the rational part, knew better. "Evan, you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. And me? I'm married for better or worse," I said, my voice heavy with resignation. "I know," he replied, his gaze unwavering, "but that doesn't change how I feel." "It has to," I whispered, feeling my resolve crumble under the weight of his sincerity. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating, and full of things we couldn't say. Finally, I stood, forcing myself to put an end to the conversation before I faltered. "I think it's best if we keep our distance for a while," I said, heading for the door. "Goodbye, Evan." The pull of temptation. Over the next few days, I threw myself into anything that could distract me: housework, errands, even a yoga class I hadn't attended in months. But no matter what I did, my thoughts always circled back to him. I found myself glancing toward his house more often than I cared to admit, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, even though I knew it would only make things harder. When Greg returned from his business trip that weekend, I tried to focus on our routine, but the distance between us felt even more glaring now, and I couldn't help but compare his detached demeanor to Evan's warmth and attention. One evening, as Greg sat on the couch, absorbed in his emails, I found myself standing by the window, staring at the faint glow of the light in Evan's living room. What would it take to feel that spark again? As the days stretched on, I knew this wasn't over, not yet. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and longing. Every time I glanced at Evan's house, a surge of guilt and desire tangled in my chest. I knew I should keep my distance, let the memory of that kiss fade into the past where it belonged. But some part of me couldn't let go. The spark he had reignited in me wasn't just about him. It was about being seen, feeling wanted and remembered as a woman, not just a wife whose presence had blended into the wallpaper of her marriage. The tension came to a head one evening, a few days after Greg had returned. He sat at the dining table, typing furiously on his laptop, the glow from the screen illuminating his face. Dinner sat untouched beside him, another cold reminder of how absent he had become, even when he was physically present. "Greg," I ventured, hoping for some kind of connection. "Are you free this weekend? Maybe we could go for a drive or have a picnic at the lake like we used to." He didn't even look up. "Can't, Janine. I've got a conference call with the Hong Kong office Saturday morning, and I need Sunday to prep for the board meeting next week." I nodded, biting back my disappointment. "Of course. I understand." And just like that, he returned to his world, leaving me alone in mine. The second encounter. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself pacing by the window. A soft light glowed from Evan's living room, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was out the door. When he opened it, the surprise on his face quickly gave way to something softer, something that made my heart skip a beat. "Janine," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "What are you doing here?" "I shouldn't be," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, but I couldn't. I just needed to talk. He led me to the couch, sitting down beside me, closer than was appropriate but not close enough to make me want to move away. I can't stop thinking about it, I confessed, my eyes fixed on my hands in my lap. About that night. Neither can I, he said, his voice steady but low. I've tried, but I can't. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the world outside that room ceased to exist. We can't do this, I said, though the words felt hollow. It's wrong. Maybe, he replied, his voice softer now. But it doesn't feel wrong. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. Because he was right. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like stepping into sunlight after years in the shade, like waking up from a long, dreary dream. Before I knew it, his hand was on mine, his touch warm and grounding. He didn't rush, didn't push, just waited, letting me decide. And in that moment, I made a choice. The line is crossed again. I leaned in, closing the distance between us. This kiss wasn't hesitant like the first. It was deeper, more deliberate, charged with the electricity of everything we hadn't said. Evan's hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself melt into him, surrendering to the moment. For the first time in years, I felt alive. But then, just as quickly as it started, reality came rushing back. I pulled away, breathless and trembling. I can't, I said, shaking my head. This isn't fair to you or to me. Evan reached for me again, but I stood, wrapping my arms around myself. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I shouldn't have come. Janine, wait, he pleaded, standing as well. Talk to me, don't shut me out. I need time, I said, stepping toward the door. I need time. Back at home, I climbed into bed beside Greg, who was already asleep, his back turned to me. The space between us felt cavernous, the quiet oppressive. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying the night in my mind. Part of me wished I could erase it, while another part clung to it like a lifeline. The next morning, I resolved to put it all behind me. I threw myself into housework, errands, and anything else that could keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. But fate had other plans. The unavoidable meeting. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was outside watering the garden when I heard his voice. Janine. I turned to find Evan standing on the other side of the fence, his expression cautious but hopeful. Hi, I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding. Can we talk? He asked. I hesitated, glancing back at the house. Greg was inside, immersed in yet another work call. I nodded, stepping closer. I wanted to apologize, Evan said. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I care about you. More than I should. His honesty took my breath away. Evan, you're young, you have so much ahead of you, and me? I'm just a bored, lonely housewife. Don't say that, he interrupted, his voice firm. You're more than that. You're smart and kind and beautiful, and you deserve to feel that way. I blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. It doesn't matter what I deserve, I said softly. What matters is what's right. And this doesn't feel right to you? He asked, his gaze locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came, because no matter how much I tried to deny it, it did feel right. Too right. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely audible. The tension. The conversation lingered in my mind for days, the weight of his words settling in my chest like a stone. Every glance at his house, every fleeting memory of his touch only made the ache worse. Greg, oblivious to the turmoil within me, carried on as usual. He was cordial, distant, and wrapped up in his own world, and the more he ignored me, the more I found myself drawn to the one person who saw me. Evan's words refused to leave my mind. Days passed, but his voice lingered in my thoughts, soft yet insistent, filling the quiet spaces of my day. Every time I looked at my husband, buried in work, speaking in clipped tones, I was reminded of the warmth and sincerity Evan had shown me. I tried to stay away from him, but the universe seemed determined to put us in each other's path, and no matter how hard I fought against it, the pull between us grew stronger, impossible to ignore. Act 2 continued, a slip into temptation. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when it happened. Greg had left for a 3-day conference, and I had the house to myself. The rhythmic patter of rain on the windows only heightened the quiet, making the empty rooms feel even more cavernous. I had just settled onto the couch with a book when there was a knock at the door. My heart jumped as I opened it to find Evan standing there, drenched from the rain but smiling sheepishly. "Sorry to bother you," he said, running a hand through his soaked hair. "I locked myself out, and my spare keys with a friend who's out of town. Do you mind if I wait here for the locksmith?" My first instinct was to say no, to send him away before I did something I couldn't take back, but his brown eyes, wide and hopeful, dissolved my resolve. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the floor. "I'll grab you a towel," I said, turning toward the hall closet. When I returned, he had taken off his wet jacket, revealing a snug-fitting t-shirt that clung to his muscular frame. I handed him the towel, avoiding his gaze as my pulse quickened. "Thanks," he said, drying his hair. "I owe you one." "No big deal," I replied, retreating to the kitchen. "Do you want some coffee while you wait?" "That'd be great." The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling the room as he leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. I handed him a steaming mug, our fingers brushing for a brief moment. "Janine," he started, his tone serious, "I've been meaning to talk to you." I tensed, gripping my own mug like a lifeline. "Evan, please don't. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you," he said, cutting me off. His voice was quiet but firm, each word carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. I set my mug down, unable to look at him. "Evan, we've talked about this. It's not right, but it feels right," he argued, stepping closer. "I know you feel it too, don't you?" I closed my eyes, trying to block out the truth in his words. When I finally met his gaze, the intensity there made my knees weak. "It doesn't matter how I feel," I said, my voice trembling. "It can't happen." "Why not?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Your husband doesn't see you, Janine, but I do. I see you." Those words, simple, powerful, shattered what little resistance I had left. The moment of no return. Before I could think better of it, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The rain outside beat against the windows, a steady drumbeat to the storm building inside me. "Evan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't say anything, just waited, letting me take the lead, and in that moment, I gave in. I kissed him. It wasn't tentative or hesitant like before. It was desperate, fueled by weeks of longing and unspoken desire. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, letting the world fade away. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands still on my waist. "I've wanted to do that since the first night we met," he confessed, his voice low and shaky. I couldn't speak. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, desire, guilt, exhilaration, and fear all colliding at once. "Stay," he whispered, his lips brushing against my temple. "Just for a little while." I don't know how long we stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the rain masking the rest of the world. But eventually, reality crept back in, pulling me from the haze. "I can't," I said, stepping back. "Evan, I can't." He nodded, his expression a mixture of understanding and disappointment. "I get it, but just so you know, I'm not going anywhere. If you ever change your mind, I'll be here." His words lingered in the air as I walked him to the door, my heart aching with every step. When he was gone, I leaned against the door, tears streaming down my face. The guilt sets in. The rest of the evening passed in a fog. I couldn't focus on anything. Every thought was consumed by what had happened. By the time I crawled into bed, the guilt was almost unbearable. I loved Greg. Or at least, I thought I did. But what kind of love could coexist with the feelings I had for Evan? I tossed and turned all night, the memory of Evan's touch haunting me, and when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with him, his smile, his warmth, the way he made me feel alive. A dangerous game. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Greg's voice on a conference call. He was already dressed, his back turned to me as he spoke about projections and deadlines. "Morning," I said, but he only waved distractedly, his attention fixed on his laptop. I watched him for a moment, my chest tightening. How had we become so distant? And why did it take someone like Evan to make me see it? That afternoon, as I folded laundry, my phone buzzed with a text. "I hope you're okay. I'm here if you need me." My heart skipped a beat. I knew I should ignore it, but my fingers moved of their own accord, typing a reply before I could stop myself. "I'm fine, thanks for checking in." It was a simple response, but it opened a door I knew I shouldn't walk through. But I wasn't ready to close it either. The days that followed my brief reply to Evan were a blur of suppressed emotions and restless nights. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart raced, half hoping it was him and half dreading what would come next. I had told myself that I would put an end to this, that the kiss, both kisses, had been mistakes that couldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The truth was, I hadn't felt this alive in years. The more I tried to push Evan out of my mind, the more he seemed to linger there, a persistent whisper in the quiet moments of my day. And Greg was as oblivious as ever, his world revolving around business meetings and late-night calls. We existed in parallel, our lives touching at the edges but never truly meeting. A chance encounter. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon when I saw him again. I was coming back from the grocery store, my arms full of bags, when Evan appeared out of nowhere. "Let me help you with that," he said, already reaching to take the bags from my hands. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. The sight of him had sent my heart into overdrive, and I wasn't sure I could trust myself around him. "Janine, please," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Let me help." Reluctantly, I let him take the heavier bags, following him up the driveway in silence. Inside, I directed him to the kitchen, trying to focus on the mundane task of putting groceries away rather than the warmth radiating from him as he moved around the small space. When the last item was stored, I turned to thank him, hoping to usher him out quickly, but he was standing close, too close, and the words caught in my throat. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. "I haven't," I lied, stepping back to put some distance between us. "I've just been busy." "Janine," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know you feel it too." "Well, feel what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My voice wavered, betraying me. "This," he said, taking a step closer. "Whatever this is between us." I shook my head, forcing myself to look away. "It doesn't matter what I feel. It can't happen." "Why not?" he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "You're not happy, Janine. You deserve to be happy." "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't know anything about my marriage." "Maybe not," he admitted. But I know how you look at me, and I know how I feel about you. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over my face. I did look at him differently, and I hated myself for it. I need you to go, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, clearly torn, but eventually nodded. I'll go, he said, his tone filled with reluctant understanding. But I'm not giving up on you, Janine. The tipping point. That evening, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, each quiet moment amplifying the storm of emotions brewing inside. By the time Greg came home, I was a bundle of frayed nerves, barely able to hold a conversation. Everything okay? He asked as he shrugged off his coat, his tone casual, disinterested. Fine, I replied, forcing a smile. Just tired. He nodded, already turning his attention to his phone. I've got a late call tonight, so don't wait up. I watched him disappear into his office, the door closing firmly behind him. The familiar ache of loneliness settled in my chest, heavier than ever. It wasn't just that Greg didn't see me. Before I could stop myself, I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over Evan's name. I told myself it was just to check on him, to make sure he was okay after our conversation earlier, but deep down, I knew better. Are you still up? His reply came almost instantly. Always for you. The warmth in those words melted the last of my resolve. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed my coat and slipped out of the house, the cool night air biting at my skin as I made my way to his door. Crossing the line, Evan opened the door before I could knock, his expression a mixture of surprise and relief. Janine, he said, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't think you'd come. I shouldn't be here, I said, my voice trembling. I couldn't stay in that house tonight. He nodded, understanding without me having to explain further. You don't have to say anything, he said, guiding me to the couch. Just stay. We don't have to talk. But I didn't come here to sit in silence. I came here because I couldn't fight this any longer. Ivan, I said, turning to face him. This is wrong. I know it is. But I can't stop thinking about you. You don't have to, he replied, his voice steady. I don't care if it's wrong. I care about you. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both tender and electric. This time, I didn't pull away. I let myself fall, let myself feel. Hours later, as I lay in his arms, the weight of what we'd done began to sink in. The guilt was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but so was something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Evan stirred beside me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft. Oh, I admitted, but I think I needed this. He didn't push for more, didn't ask for explanations. He just held me, his presence steady and grounding. When I finally left, the house was dark and silent. Greg's office door was still closed, the faint glow of his computer screen visible through the crack. I slipped upstairs, my footsteps silent as I climbed into bed beside him. I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying every moment with Evan. I knew this couldn't last, that it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down around us. But for now, I let myself hold on to the memory, even as the guilt coiled tighter around my chest. The morning after. The next morning, Greg was already gone by the time I came downstairs. The house felt impossibly quiet, the echoes of my choices reverberating in every corner. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me from my thoughts. Last night was everything. I hope you're okay. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Finally, I typed out a simple reply. I don't know what I'm doing, Evan, but I can't stop. His reply came quickly. And don't stop. Just let yourself feel. I set the phone down, my hands shaking. I knew I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and once I stepped off, there would be no going back. And yet, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The days after my night with Evan felt like a waking dream, or maybe a nightmare. I floated through my routines, haunted by the ghost of my decisions. The guilt coiled tighter around my chest, but with it came an undeniable warmth, the memory of his touch, his words, and the way he made me feel seen. But it couldn't last. Greg came home earlier than expected one evening, his briefcase in hand and his brow furrowed. He tossed his coat over the back of a chair and went straight to the kitchen where I was stirring a pot of soup. I glanced up, startled by his presence. "You're back early," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Blake got canceled," he said flatly, pouring himself a glass of water. "You've been quiet lately. Is something going on?" The question caught me off guard, my heart stuttering in my chest. "Quiet? No, just busy." He leaned against the counter, scrutinizing me with a look I hadn't seen in years. "You sure? You seem different." These. Different. The word landed heavily between us. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words refused to come. How could I explain what I had done, what I was still doing? Greg didn't press further. Instead, he sighed, kissed my forehead absently, and retreated to his office. But his words stayed with me, a seed of doubt planted in the fragile foundation of my affair. The breaking point. That weekend, the tension between Greg and me reached a boiling point. It started small, his irritation over a misplaced file, my annoyance at his dismissive tone, but it quickly escalated into something far bigger. "You're always distracted lately," he snapped as we stood in the living room. "What's going on with you?" "Maybe I'm tired of feeling invisible," I shot back before I could stop myself. He blinked, clearly taken aback. "Invisible? What are you talking about? I work my ass off to give us a good life." "That's just it, Greg. It's your life. I'm just here, filling the space." His face darkened, his jaw tightening. "So this is my fault now? You're unhappy because I'm trying to provide for us?" I said, my voice breaking. "I'm unhappy because you stopped seeing me years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Greg stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Neither did I. The unraveling. That night, as Greg slept in the guest room, I found myself unable to stay in the house. I grabbed my coat and slipped out, my feet carrying me next door before I could think twice. Evan answered the door almost immediately, his concern evident as he took in my tear-streaked face. "Janine, what's wrong?" he asked, pulling me inside. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm tearing my life apart." He led me to the couch, his hands warm and steady on mine. "Talk to me. What happened?" "It's Greg," I said, my words spilling out in a rush. "He knows something's wrong, and he's right. I'm not the person I used to be. I don't even know who I am anymore." "You're more than you give yourself credit for," Evan said softly. "You've just forgotten how to see yourself. And maybe I've been selfish too." I looked at him, surprised. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I care about you, Janine, more than I should. But I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be close to you, to make you feel the way you deserve to feel. But maybe that wasn't fair." The vulnerability in his voice broke something in me. I reached out, covering his hands with mine. "Evan, you've given me something I haven't felt in years, and I'll never regret that. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep lying to Greg, to you, to myself." "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I'm saying this has to end," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Not because I don't care about you, but because I need to figure out who I am before I can give anything to anyone. The goodbye. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. Greg had left a note on the kitchen counter, his handwriting neat and precise. Janine, I need some time to think. I'll be at a hotel for a few days. Maybe we both need this time to figure out what we want. I stared at the note for a long time, the weight of his words settling heavily on my chest. This was what I had feared most. Not just losing Greg, but losing the life we had built together, however flawed it might have been. But as I stood there, another thought began to take shape. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, not with Evan, not with Greg, but with myself, finding myself again. Over the next few weeks, I began to piece myself back together. I spent time alone, reflecting on what had led me to this point. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper in a way I hadn't done in years. I reconnected with old friends, went to yoga classes, and even signed up for a painting workshop. Greg and I spoke occasionally, our conversations cautious but civil. He asked for space, and I gave it to him, unsure of where we stood but determined not to force the issue. As for Evan, I saw him less and less. We exchanged a few texts, kind, respectful, but distant. He understood that I needed to focus on myself, and for that I was grateful. The resolution. One evening, a month after everything had unraveled, Greg came home. He stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain as he held his suitcase. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. The conversation that followed was raw, honest, and painful. We acknowledged our faults, our failures, and the distance that had grown between us. For the first time in years, we truly talked, not as husband and wife, but as two people trying to understand each other. "I want to try," he said finally, "if you're willing." I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. "I want to try too. But things have to change, Greg. We both have to change." He nodded, his eyes softening. "I know." The beginning of something new. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, of struggle, and of regret. But slowly, Greg and I began to rebuild what we had lost, brick by brick. And along the way, I found pieces of myself I thought I had lost forever. As for Evan, he eventually moved away, chasing opportunities that were waiting for him beyond our quiet neighborhood. We didn't say goodbye formally, but I knew it was for the best. He'd given me some, and as I stood in my garden one sunny morning, the hydrangeas blooming around me, I realized something profound. I had invited my young neighbor over for dinner, and in doing so, I had opened a door I didn't know needed opening. Not to him, but to myself. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that my life had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. Evan was gone. He had left a note in my mailbox one quiet morning, thanking me for everything and wishing me happiness. It was bittersweet, but I knew it was for the best. He had his whole life ahead of him, and I had to focus on rebuilding my own. Greg and I attended couples therapy, a decision we had both hesitated on but ultimately embraced. The sessions were hard, forcing us to confront years of neglect and miscommunication. But with every session, I felt a spark of something returning, not the blind love of our early years, but a quiet, mature understanding. A chance to build something new. For the first time in years, I began to prioritize myself. I took up painting, a hobby I'd long abandoned, and reconnected with old friends. I even started volunteering at a local shelter, finding fulfillment in giving back. These small steps helped me rediscover who I was, beyond being a wife, beyond the mistakes I'd made. Greg and I weren't perfect, but we were trying. We shared more conversations, more laughter, and even more silence. Comfortable, healing silence. We were finding our way back to each other, one fragile moment at a time. And while Evan remained a bittersweet memory, I would always be grateful to him. He had reminded me of something I had forgotten, that I was still alive, still capable of feeling, still capable of change. In some strange, painful way, he had been the catalyst for everything. As I stood on my porch one morning, watching the sun rise over the quiet neighborhood, I felt a strange sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years,